Martin Scorsese's The Irishman stars Robert De Niro, Joe Pesci and Al Pacino and follows mob hitman Frank Sheeran. Sheeran works for mafia boss Russell Bufalino and eventually is sent to work for Jimmy Hoffa, head of the Teamsters Union, who he develops a close relationship with. Hoffa has a business relationship with the gangsters involved in the unions. The mob takes cash from Hoffa through his Teamsters pension fund for their projects, such as Las Vegas casinos. In return, Hoffa, as well as charging interest from the loans he gives out, used the mob's muscle to take on big business who hired goons to shake up strikes Hoffa organized. These are just a few ways in which Hoffa and the mob worked together, but crucially, the Teamsters pension fund loans were dished out on Hoffa's terms. When Hoffa is sent to jail for fraud, he leaves Frank Fitzsimmons in charge, but Fitzsimmons assumes more and more control over the union, putting his people in positions of power and pushing out Hoffa loyalists. The mob takes a liking to having Fitz in charge of the Teamsters, as he's a pushover, and they can squeeze more money out of him. After 5 years though, Hoffa is released from prison and fights to take back control of his union. Interestingly, something the Irishman leaves out is that a condition of Hoffa's early release, which the mob may or may not have had something to do with, was a clause that he was not to rerun for presidency of the Teamsters for a number of years, and he fights this decision too. In any case, in addition to preferring Fitz anyway, the mob becomes irritated with Hoffa's rhetoric in public, saying on TV and to reporters that Frank Fitzsimmons has handed over control of the Teamsters to the mob. He threatens to release documents and files incriminating gangsters, and eventually the bosses have enough, and Frank Sheeran is sent to whack Jimmy, his close friend. Now, videos on The Irishman tend to bring up similar comments that are repeated over and over, but in this video, we're not here to talk about the real history of The Irishman and whether it's a true story. Was it really the mob who took out Hoffa? Did Frank Sheeran really kill Hoffa? Was De Niro miscast as Sheeran and too old to play the role? Was The Irishman a boring, overlong film? Well, that's not what we're discussing today. What I wanted to talk about in this video was just when did the mob decide to whack Hoffa? In other words, at what point in the film was the decision made to take Hoffa out? It sounds like a simple question, but there doesn't seem to necessarily be a concrete answer. There are tensions between Hoffa and the mob all throughout the second half of the film after Hoffa comes out of the can. Frank Sheeran Appreciation Night is full of uneasy scenes. There's the build-up to Bill Bufalino's daughter's wedding with the whole thing about getting Hoffa to come to the wedding so the situation can be sorted out. But then all of a sudden, in a scene between Sheeran and Bufalino, Russell tells Sheeran that they did all they could for the man, and the next morning, in so many words, tells him he will be killing him. So when exactly was this decision made? There seems to be several places in the film's timeline where the okay could have been given. Could it even be that it was as early as Jimmy Hoffa and Tony Pro's first altercation in the can, in that as soon as Jimmy and Tony Pro fought, Pro went to the phone and demanded that Hoffa had to go. You wouldn't put it past him, given how volatile Pro was and that he hated Hoffa. Here is Jimmy, a mob associate, a non-made man, and he dares to insult him with his "you people" remark, and then lays hands on him during the fight. Surely he went straight to his boss, Fat Tony Salerno, and asked for James Riddle Hoffa on a spit. Of course, this request would be laughed away by Salerno if Tony Pro did ask for it, even if done later when Jimmy and Pro have their second fight. Jimmy asks Frank if Russell would be willing to make Pro go away, but Sheeran says it's unlikely. If Jimmy is able to ask for Pro to be whacked at this stage of the story, Pro would surely be doing the same thing, asking Fat Tony for the okay. But Fat Tony's attitude during the meeting with Bufalino and Sheeran, the first one, highlights that there's no way the killing of Jimmy Hoffa was seriously considered at this point. He looks bored and mildly irritated with the beef between Jimmy and Pro, referring to it as bullshit. However, this is completely different the second time Bufalino and Sheeran take a trip to East Harlem, when they're watching Hoffa on the TV saying Fitzsimmons has sold the Teamsters out and the mob controls the union. He openly says billions of dollars have been given to known racketeers and makes the ominous declaration that it's time for the rats to abandon ship. Salerno is naturally furious, aggressive in this second scene and asking if Hoffa is serious. Maybe he means what he says. He can't talk that way, it's no fucking good, as he says. It says something about the gravitas of Hoffa's statement that you've got two mob bosses arguing about it, each on the flip side of the argument. the respected Bufalino trying his best to claim Hoffa is just saying whatever he needs to say for his re-election campaign. But if Hoffa planned to make good on his promise, it would spell serious trouble for the mob, and Fat Tony wastes no time in telling Sheeran that maybe someone should tell Hoffa to cash in his retirement check and enjoy his life with his family. Essentially, he sends the message to Hoffa to retire, to walk away. Already, things are serious. Lesser men would have already been whacked after what Hoffa said. The mob takes no chances when it comes to rats and snitches. The real-life case of Joseph Valachi may have been on Fat Tony's mind when he watched Hoffa openly announce the mob's involvement in the Teamsters' monetary funds. It reminds me of a scene in Casino, where mob boss Remo Gaggi advises Andy Stone to tell Sam Ace Rothstein that maybe he should walk away. And as Stone tells Ace, when the old man says maybe, not only should you quit, you should run. So a clear warning had been sent to Hoffa, though it's clear no actual death warrant had been signed, in spite of the rising tensions with the constant cuts back and forward between Hoffa and Sheeran, and Fat Tony meeting with Sheeran and Bufalino. At this point in time, Jimmy failed to understand the gravity of the situation, as shown in the scene between him and Sheeran where he asks who said he should walk away. He first asks if it was Russell, then says of course it wasn't Russ. He assumes it's Tony Pro until Sheeran says it's Salerno. Hoffa is visibly taken aback. There's no exposition here to tell us how important and high up Salerno is, but Hoffa's reaction shows he wasn't expecting Salerno to say such a thing and has for the first time realized that his problems and the things he has said on TV might be a bit more damaging than he first realized. Perhaps we too as the audience, unless you knew the story going into the film, didn't understand the gravity of the situation until this scene. The next time we see Salerno, he is so angry that he has Hoffa reminded that Joey Gallo liked to make a lot of noise as well. An even more of a direct threat, as of course Gallo was taken out by the mob. In fact, Sheeran himself did the deed in the film, but I think we can safely say that no one had stamped the approval on Jimmy's murder just yet. However, this may have been because of Bufalino's influence, downplaying Jimmy's actions and fighting his corner. Who knows? Without Russell's support, Jimmy may have already been a dead man by this point in the film. Frank Sheeran Appreciation Night is very telling and interesting. Salerno and Jimmy hilariously stare each other out, but Fat Tony's conversation with Russ reveals that Jimmy's been holding up the mob's loans. If there's one thing the mafia can't stand, it's when you lighten their pockets, and on top of that, Jimmy has said he's going to call in the old loans and is taking them over if they aren't paid straight away. Even Bufalino is alarmed, repeatedly asking Salerno if he's sure Jimmy said that, because of course calling in the old loans and taking over if people aren't able to pay has huge implications. The ever-calm Bufalino talks face to face with Hoffa for the first and only time in the film, trying to gently nudge Jimmy into retirement. But Jimmy understood what was happening, understood that he was being threatened and the mob was basically telling him to back off, but was sending the best person to go in and tell him directly. When the meeting ends, Bufalino looks insulted, furious even. Perhaps this is where he turns, where he thinks, fuck this, and no longer defends Hoffa. And if it's up to a vote to take Hoffa out, he's no longer on Hoffa's side. And before the night ends, Jimmy is well aware his life has been threatened, but it seems he is now deluded and cannot conceive of the idea that the mob would ever take him out. When Hoffa is dancing with Peggy, the camera whip pans to Pro, Salerno and Bufalino looking sinister, watching Hoffa. This could easily be the moment where the decision is made that Hoffa will die. The dynamic between the three is clear even though we can't hear what's being said. Pro is trying his best to convince the other two, Bufalino is the voice of reason, and Fat Tony is simply glaring at Hoffa, thinking, rationalizing, coming to a decision. By the time they get up, it looks like they're all on the same page and something has been agreed. Even Peggy sees something evil is stirring. This is a good as part as any in the film to think that this is where the mob decided enough was enough and to whack Hoffa. It makes subsequent scenes more sinister. For example, in the next scene, Russell gives Frank the ring, which he was going to give him anyway, but maybe Russell was using it as a way to sway Sheeran now that the decision has been made, to tell Frank, you're with us, not him, you're with me. It's a touching gesture giving Frank the ring, but you can't help but think it's also a manipulation tactic. If true, this makes the rest of the series of events even more sad, as it means all of Sheeran's efforts were in vain as the hit had already been agreed. Russell tells Frank it's what it is, it's what they want, it's how far things have gotten. So it's not certain that a hit had been placed, but it's now open that this is what the mob wants. And it's really only Bufalino in Hoffa's corner. But as we've seen from the previous scene with Jimmy and Russell, Russell ain't too hot about Jimmy right now either, even if he just made a last-ditch effort to mend things. Of course, if the hit had been agreed by this point, it does beg the question as to why Russell would still tell Sheeran to speak to Hoffa. Maybe there was hope to reverse the decision. Maybe it was so that he, Russell, would look like he tried to the very end to save Frank's friend. Or maybe it was to show everyone that Frank was trying to get Jimmy to calm down, that he played his part and as such should not be included in the murder, which was very much a possibility, especially with Frank's earlier speech publicly declaring being behind Jimmy all the way. It's not as if Russell could have told Frank right there that Hoffa was going to die. There was too much risk. When he eventually told him, there was no way out for Hoffa unless Frank tips him off, and the mob would know about it, and Frank would also go. The wedding, we're told, was supposed to be a peace mission. The mob may be itching for Hoffa's death, but if the okay hadn't already been given, surely it was when Hoffa all of a sudden refused to come. What more are we supposed to do, they must have thought. He's demonstrating a failure to show appreciation by refusing to sit down, and the mob must have been frustrated by this point. They didn't need him anyway, they had Fitz. It was out of respect for old arrangements that Hoffa was still standing. Even though Hoffa turned down the sit-down, Sheeran tells a bewildered Bufalino that he's thinking about it, and McGee would surely have read between the lines. After all, what is there to think about? So you can't accuse the mob of not trying, unless of course the hit had already been agreed to at Frank Sheeran Appreciation Night, and sinisterly, all this talk about arranging a sit-down was actually an attempt to arrange Jimmy's murder. Russell makes a few mysterious phone calls during their car trip, with Sheeran standing a distance away, too far to hear what the conversation is about. At one point, Bufalino comes back from a call and tells Sheeran to call Jimmy, saying he said he was going to think about it. Perhaps Bufalino had just gotten off the phone with Salerno or Tony Jacks, who were deliberating, asking Bufalino, is he going to sit down or not? Or maybe even, just whack the guy and be done with it. Bufalino was Hoffa's main line of defense, but much less so than before. There's two ways to look at this. Either the tensions are sky high and everyone is anxious to see what Jimmy will decide, or alternatively, Hoffa has already been marked for death. In fact, that very phone call that Bufalino had made may have been the final okay on Hoffa's life, and it's why Bufalino wanted to know Jimmy's plans so they can arrange the hit. So when Sheeran phones Hoffa, who all of a sudden has agreed to a meeting organised by Tony Jacks, Sheeran was inadvertently setting up the hit. Very good, as Bufalino remarks when learning Hoffa has agreed to the sit-down. There's no subsequent calls, so by this point, Bufalino must know that Hoffa is a dead man walking. Tony Jacks is Tony Pro's cousin, who reports to Tony Salerno, who will be in contact with Russell Bufalino. The chain of command were all in on the know. I wonder if things would have been different if Jimmy had agreed to the sit-down earlier when he turned it down. Maybe the mob got frustrated and said, just kill him. Now that Jimmy had agreed to the sit-down and taken the bait, Russell can reveal to Frank that there's been a change and that we did all we could for the man. The facade is lifted. There was never any sit-down. Hoffa arranged his own death. Bufalino was quite aggressive during the cornflake scene. More can be said in another video analysis. But I imagine Bufalino had to fight to keep Sheeran alive, and meanwhile, Sheeran is all Jimmy, 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 Jimmy. So he was irritated at first at Sheeran, in full employer mode, until he dropped the pretense and spoke to Frank as a friend. So all in all, from what we see in the film, I think there's two moments that stick out as to when a hit was sanctioned against Hoffa. The scene where Pro, Salerno and Bufalino are talking at Frank Sheeran Appreciation Night, and the second possibility is when Bufalino has the second phone call. I'm not sure which I personally go for. Maybe the shot of the trio, but there's perhaps a bias there because it's my favourite shot of the film. But it does make sense story-wise, and the way the subsequent scenes with Sheeran, Bufalino and their wives play out, all slow and deliberate, give off the feeling that something is off, something is not quite right. Then again, maybe all involved really did give it their best shot with Jimmy, and when he refused to come to the wedding for the sit down, they just thought, let's get rid of this guy. So when do you think the mob decided to kill Hoffa? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to let me know if you'd like to see more videos on The Irishman. And thanks for watching.